Anyway, so Abiathar as well, who was a priest that sided with Adonijah, he is banished to his hometown, and basically his home estate. He's stripped of his priestly duty, but he's granted mercy because he was loyal to David during his days, and he also carried the ark, which is interesting as well. You see that Solomon had a respect for this religious office, and so he grants him mercy. And so we see that Solomon isn't just trying to shed blood, carelessly, but he is looking to give people mercy. And that also brings us to Shammai. And you brought it up, I think, Bruce, that Shammai was given this deal. And what was that deal that he was given when Solomon met with him after David died? Yeah.
He'd be okay as long as he didn't leave his house. But when he went and run after the slaves were going away, now he's got problems.
Yep, his slaves run away, and he makes that deal with Solomon, and Solomon tells him, look, if you stay within the boundaries here, then you're good. I won't put you to death, but if you leave these boundaries, then we're going to have problems. And so that's exactly what happens. Is he loses some of his servants run away. It seems like a really good reason for Shammai to leave. I got to go get my servants, right? And so he leaves, but Solomon says, look, we made this deal, what were you thinking? And so he has him put to death as well, ultimately. But what we see there again is that Solomon gave him that initial mercy. Here you have a man that once opposed the king to his face under a monarchy, calling him a murderer, throwing stones at him. David grants him mercy by not having him put to death. Again, as JC was saying, these were different times. You do that in any other kingdom, what's going to happen? You do that to Nebuchadnezzar, what do you think would have happened? He would have been put to death right on the spot. Right. And so he's granted mercy again. David's thinking about him on his deathbed. And he tells Solomon to deal with him. And Solomon again grants him mercy, even though David was strongly hinting to Solomon that he should put him to death. But Solomon grants him mercy, and here again, Shammai, he blows it, doesn't he? It's just kind of interesting. Again, I don't want us to think that Solomon was just looking to shed blood, but ultimately, the reason why all these things happen, number one, is because man is in control. And whenever man is in control, things are messy. But number two, at the end of chapter 2, what are the last words that are said at chapter 2? It says in chapter 2 at the very end, the very last verse, 46, the last words of 46 says, thus the kingdom was established in the hands of Solomon. All of this, you look at all this inner turmoil that was going on, with the family of David and his own military. It creates this mess. And how can the kingdom be firmly established when you have this internal mess going on? But I was thinking about this, and I think that acts of authority have to be made in order to establish a kingdom, don't they? Mm-hmm. And so, with the President of the United States, that can be as simple as coming in and cleaning out the previous cabinet, getting rid of all the people who formerly worked there and putting in your own employees. Under a monarchy, it looks a little different. It looks similar, but the people that they don't want there are being put to death, right? But I think about Jesus, and what's the act of authority that he did in order to establish his kingdom? He defeats death. He exercises authority over death. You have these monarchies that are exercising authority over the physical world, putting people to death. But Jesus overcomes the one thing that we're all subject to. He exercises authority over the one thing that none of us have authority over, and that's death. And thus, he establishes his kingdom in that way. And again, showing the superiority of Christ over man as king. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on to chapter 3?
Just a comment, Sam. Solomon was known to be a man of peace, and I think it's interesting that in at least two of these men's cases, he did show them mercy. Adonijah, if he would have behaved himself, he would have still lived, and then Shammai, if he had stayed at home, he'd have lived. So there was some mercy extended to them, and really their death came about by their own actions.
Well, and in the case of Joab too, he was simply exacting justice there. He murdered two people. It wasn't even in the middle of war. It was just cold-blooded murder after, you think about with Abner, David had made an alliance with him, and problems were solved, and he goes out and he kills Abner. And so he was executing justice. I would think one of the reasons why David didn't do it in his days because he had shed enough blood, or maybe he was too close to Joab, and it was hard for him to make that move. But anyways, it is interesting. I appreciate that comment. So we move on to 1 Kings chapter 3. Does anybody want to read verses 1? Let's do verses 1 through 5. verses 1 through 5. Anybody want to read that? Any volunteers to read? Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Okay. Beginning in verse 1. Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. And then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house, and the house of the Lord, and the wall all around Jerusalem. Meanwhile the people sacrificed at the high places, because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask, what shall I give you?"
Okay, so, yeah, go ahead, Wayne.
Just one quick word there in verse 4. That was the great high place.
Yes.
Just definition between elevation and a cool city.
Yeah, yeah, well, I mean, the high place would have been where they went and offered sacrifices, and it also was where people were going to worship idols, right? False gods.
Yes, but it doesn't mean necessarily elevation.
Yeah.
As it means impressive.
Yes.
The city.
Yeah, I would have to look into that myself. I didn't know that, so I appreciate you bringing that out. Yeah. Yeah, Linda.
I read a little bit this Gibeon. It had the tent and the
Yeah, the tents of meeting.
yeah, and the burnt altar
Yes.
of Brazil
Yeah.
was there, and so he really went there to worship where things were that represented the tabernacle.
Right.
Except for the.
So, well, yeah, there's several theories on this, and this is why I want to bring this out, and that's why I want to look at this. As I look at this, we look at Solomon's life, right, and we think, Solomon, he's the wisest king, he starts off great, but we know in 1 Kings chapter 11 what happens to Solomon. Yeah.
I think back to when Solomon was just a child. I don't know how old he was when maybe he died, but when he was a teenager, he could just, well, show me photo and try to take the one out. I'm on charge.
Yeah.
But he didn't. He said, I'm just a little child.
Mhm.
I don't know what's how to go out and come in.
Right.
That showed a lot of,
Humility, yes, it did for sure. We'll talk about that.
But then I wondered about this, high places he's talking about.
So, yeah,
Definitely against God's pleasure.
Yeah, and so on one hand we see this humility shown by Solomon, but we also see some problems that are presented in these first few verses. And that's why I bring out the fact, we think about Solomon and he's this great king, all these great accomplishments that we read about in Ecclesiastes, and we see this great prayer, this great display of humility before God and great faithfulness. And then we get to 1 Kings 11 where it says that these women turned his heart away, and we all go, well, what happened? Right, so did that just happen suddenly, or are there some problems even what we just read here with Solomon and kind of in his early days?
That's what I was wondering when he did this right first when he first became king.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on in his life, he turned again.
Mm-hmm.
So evidently it's his government.
Yeah, exactly. He had a tendency. So we see one problem. The first problem, what is that? Well, he marries the wrong woman, doesn't he?
Right.
He marries the wrong woman, and why is it the wrong woman?
She's born.
Yeah, his foreign wife, and so what was wrong with that? It's not simply that God's a racist, but why is it that God didn't want them marrying foreign women?
Well, because of their worship and what they worshiped, and it wasn't following the true God.
That was their faith, right?
Right, and so that was always condemned, but Solomon did that, and then that became his demise, as you said in chapter 11.
Yeah.
More foreign women and all the concubines, and it just increased.
Yep, exactly. So in Deuteronomy 7, remember what David told him. Do all according to the law of Moses, essentially is what he tells them. We read in Deuteronomy that the kings are supposed to write word for word what the law says. They're supposed to have their own copy that they wrote themselves. one of the things that they were told, and this wasn't specifically to kings, but this was the whole nation of Israel, but when you go into Israel to inherit, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons. For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Now, one could look at this and say, okay, well, this was in regards to the people dwelling in the land of Canaan. And so it does kind of make me wonder, knowing that Solomon must have gone through and read the old law, it makes me wonder if he maybe finds a loophole, as we so often think we do, and says, well, this was an instruction given to people entering the land of Canaan. I can take it in the Egyptian wife. I don't know, that's very conjectural, but I know our brains often work that way, where we'll look at something, and this is a way of interpreting scripture now today, that people will say, well, that applied to them now, it doesn't apply to me today. Whereas, well, no, there's a principle there, and we need to make sure we're adhering to it. Yeah.
It almost appears to me, Sam, that we're applying men's knowledge, because oftentimes kings would marry other kings' daughters as a political alliance, to set up a treaty or an alliance. And so God said don't marry other women, but this is almost like man interjecting himself, saying, yeah, but God, I got to make this political alliance. So I just wonder if that was possibly the case.
No, that's exactly what the case is, because you see, not only does he marry a foreign woman, but the reason he does it is so he can make an alliance with Egypt, which, as Brian said, that's spot on. JC?
Well, my question would be, you see two different things at the beginning of this chapter. You see him marrying a foreign woman, and him sacrificing at the high places. But the immediate next thing you see isn't a rebuke, it's a, what do you need from me?
It's God revealing himself, which is an act of grace, isn't it? If he's going there to worship false idols, or every time I read this, the way I interpret it is Israel had this way of attempting to worship God that was completely wrong. And we know that God didn't want them worshiping in the high places. And so it's possible that Solomon goes there to worship God, but he's doing it in the wrong way. But either way, it's an act of grace if that is the case, if what Solomon is doing is wrong. It's an act of grace that God reveals himself and says, okay, what do you need, right?
Yeah, but why no rebuke in that? I mean, I understand grace, and normally God would say, hey, you messed up, I'm going to overlook it, and here's how I'm going to help you, but instead it's just...
Well, and that's why I say it's one of the possibilities. Some people think that he just went there to worship God, and this is the place where he did it, and this is where people went to worship gods, but he's going there simply to proclaim and to worship his God. And so that is a possibility as well. And I'm not saying that I'm set on any one of those, I was just throwing out the possibilities for sure. So, yeah.
Well, we know that high places became a big issue all through Second Kings, but we go to First Chronicles, and it has the same story. And the tent of meetings is there. And he has to, in order to go before God, he has to sacrifice, which is a mirror of Jesus. He has to sacrifice and present himself to God. So it's not a high place like there's idols there. It's the people of God worshiping at the tent of meeting.
No, and I mean, I see that as well. All I'm doing is laying it. There are multiple possibilities to that, and that is one of them. I don't want us to look at Solomon and think that he couldn't have done wrong at this stage, because I believe that he could have. We see the people of Israel, right when they're delivered out of the land of Egypt, what they do, they turn around, they make a golden calf. But in their minds, they weren't worshiping a golden calf. In their minds, they're ascribing this image to God, the one that just saved them. And so what I'm saying is they're trying to worship God, but they're doing it in the wrong way. And I just look at this and I think it's a possibility that maybe Solomon and other people in Israel are doing the same thing. They're trying to worship God, but they're doing it in the wrong way. They're trying to do it in a way that conforms to their idea of who God is. Or he worships God and offers sacrifice, which is interesting that he changes it up. But yeah, you're right, the tent of meeting is in Gibeon. And so all I'm doing is laying out some possibilities there. But he forms an alliance with Egypt. And in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 16, it says of the king that only he must not acquire many horses for himself. That's okay. Sorry, I thought it was an alarm. I thought we were having to clear out. We'll give it a second.
That'll wake you up.
Yeah, well. That's loud. You have no problems hearing that ringtone. Are you? That's impressive. No, you're okay. But you see in Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 16, that one of the commands given was that he wasn't to acquire many. I mean, you just can't. He's already kind of, in some ways, implementing man's wisdom, as Brian was talking about, rather than just following and walking faithfully behind God and just having one alliance with God. And that's ultimately how our attitude needs to be. And so we also see again that he worshipped as a high place. When we talk about that, there's 2 or 3 ways to interpret that. Maybe he was just going there to worship God. It was okay, and that's why you don't see a rebuke. But I do find it interesting in verse. In verse where it says that verse 3. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. It seems like that is something that he wasn't supposed to be doing as you read that type of verbiage in verse 3. But again, there's multiple ways to interpret it. And so we kind of already talked about that, and I appreciate the comments on it. So basically, I look at these 3 things. He marries a foreign woman. He makes an alliance with Egypt. He's not supposed to do that. And possibly worshiping at the high places was something that he ought not to do. We see later in life, he's turned away, not just because of women, but he's turned away to false gods, idols, false gods. And so we possibly see some early warning signs with Solomon. And so if I were to sum it up, I'd just say Solomon's love for the Lord was fragile, as is the case with all of us, isn't it? It says Solomon loved the Lord, except he did this. Solomon loves the Lord, but he breaks the commandment by marrying the wrong woman. Solomon loves the Lord, but he's implementing man's wisdom in order to make this alliance with Egypt, which seems like a savvy political move, but it's not what God wants them to do. Our love is fragile, isn't it? We need to make sure that we aren't allowing our wisdom to get in the way of love for God and following faithfully behind him. What were you saying, Dave?
I said that man's trying to justify their own action.
Yeah, exactly. We do that all the time as well. And so in verses 5 through 15, we read this about Solomon and we kind of see, okay, maybe we can see how this culminates in him falling away in chapter 11. But again, we see this great prayer and this great conversation that goes on between him and God. We'll read verses 5 through 15. We only have just a few minutes left. I'm not wearing a watch. I don't know why I just looked at my wrist like I was wearing a watch. But verses 5 through 15, or actually 6 through 15, says, Then Solomon said, You shown great loving kindness to your servant David my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne. And it is this day now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? It was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. God said to him, Because you have asked this thing, and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning mind, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. Then Solomon awoke. Behold, it was a dream, and he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered burnt offerings, and made peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. And so we see that encounter with God, which took place in a dream, although it was a real conversation that happened. It led him to go into Jerusalem and worship him. There's a few things that I want us to notice, and I know that we're running out of time here. But there are 2 words used 5 times in verses 5 through 15. The first one is ask. What's the other one that matches the 5 times the word ask is used? Any ideas? Give. What's that, Dean?
Give.
That's right. 5 times you see the word ask. 5 times you see the word give. Does God not constantly invite us, in this case, to ask for wisdom? And he will give it, won't he? That's what James 1 is all about. If we ask God for wisdom, he'll give it to us, because he gives liberally to all, without reproach. And James tells us not to do it with doubting, because the person who doubts is like what? He's like a storm-tossed sea, essentially, isn't he? It's problems. Yeah.
The thing that I pick up out of it is that he asked for, when we say wisdom,
Yeah.
we all think of smart.
Yeah.
You know, Einstein, you know, these kind of people.
Mm-hmm.
And what he was asking for was the ability to lead the people,
Yep.
which is a different type of wisdom than I think we think of.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was more specific and in line with what God wanted to see.
Yes.
His concern for the people, not for how smart I am.
Yep. Yeah, and next week, we're out of time. Next week, we'll talk more about what wisdom is, but one way that I would define it. Anybody know the idea between wisdom and knowledge? The difference between it?
Application of it.
That's right. Wisdom is applied knowledge, right? You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you're not applying it, you're a fool. You're not wise, right?
Just a quick thought, we
Yeah.
talked last week about the age of Solomon.
Yeah.
Well, not to point him out necessarily, but still with Jack or Hewlin, if they wanted to give wisdom to me, I would trust it because of their experience, of their age,
Yeah.
their life.
Yeah.
Solomon, when he took this over, he didn't have any of that. And again, it's what kind of reinforces into me that he was youthful. And he said, I don't even know how to go in or go out at my age. You know, please give me wisdom as if I was like an elder who had those experiences. So I think that's just kind of underscoring his age factor.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine how overwhelming that would be to be, I mean, let's give him the oldest estimation that's out there. It happens to be the most common also, but 20 years old. Can you imagine taking over a kingdom at 20? You're gonna need wisdom. Yeah, Jeff.
My previous boss was only 36 years old, but his wisdom surpasses a lot of people I know who are 60 or 70 in the business world based on his experience and application of research in an appropriate manner. And it really is something we see over and over in the scriptures, is people of age. It really comes down to their abilities to discern the knowledge and then apply it. In fact, Bruce Carroll's uncle was a very wise man, had a lot of wisdom. It's not always the person who has all the knowledge of scripture, it's the application of the situation.
Yeah.
Your life experience can be more at 40 than can be somebody at 60, just based on what you've been through.
Yeah, in other words, age doesn't always guarantee wisdom, does it? But the way we get wisdom is by learning to apply that knowledge we have, whatever knowledge we do have, as early in life as possible. The more we do that, the more wisdom we'll find that we have. Yeah, appreciate that, Jeff. Yeah, one more, we got to close.
Just a quick comment, with regards to all of that, Solomon asked, and God was pleased with his request, and gave him more than what he asked for, but verse 14 points out very clearly it was conditional. So long as you walk in accordance. If he does not walk, that's off. You've got to walk in his ordinances and what he has said. If you do not do that, then that's off. So it's conditional, same as for us as Christians. As long as we walk according to his will, God will bless us in that.
Yep.
But the minute we turn to the left or to the right, well then now guess what? You step out of his protection zone, and you protect out of his grace.
Yep, yeah, God's covenants are conditional. We see that time and time again. Yep. Alright, any other comments or questions? We'll close right there. We don't have any time anyway. So thanks a lot for comments and questions.